Hey, welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. Hey, before we get into today's episode, I wanted to remind you about a couple of things we've got going on. First, we've got the Patreon link in the bio and in the show notes. So if you want to sign up, I would love your help. I need your help to bring this great content that you're about to hear. And so sign up for the Patreon at any dollar amount. That's going to help. It's a great way to connect, and we can dialogue and ask more questions on Patreon, so sign up for that. The other thing I wanted to make you aware of is today's episode is brought to you by Gold River Trading Company. Gold River Trading Company is an American-based, non-woke Christian tea company. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, Chase, what in the world are you doing having a tea company on Foolproof Theology? That doesn't seem like very foolproof content and a drink that's not very strong. Well, the reason I love it is because I've been looking for opportunities to partner with brands that are unapologetically pro-America and non-woke, and they are definitely one. They've got tea I had this morning, which was great. They're American breakfast tea. And then they also have, because it's that time of year, a pumpkin spice tea. It's warm and savory, as it says on here. And so if you've got a lady in your life who is obsessed with pumpkin spice lattes from Starbucks, trade it out for this. You can make this at home for her. She'll love you for it. And buy it at goldriverco.com. Use promo code theology for 15% off your order. Go to goldriverco.com and use promo code theology for 15% off your order. Welcome to Foolproof Theology. It is good to be with you. Today on the show, I've got Troy Frasier. He is the host of the Revived Thoughts podcast, as well as a couple of other podcasts dealing with missionaries and martyrs and devotionals. And so we're going to be covering a lot of ground today. But Troy, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Nay, I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
So Troy, for my listeners, we were talking a little bit off air, but you're based out of Indonesia, is that right?
Yeah, currently we are in Indonesia right now, and been here for a few months getting to know the lay of the land.
Okay, and what led you over to Indonesia?
So before this, I was a Bible teacher at a small school in Cambodia, and we left America a little over a year ago, went through all the COVID hassles you can imagine to get there. Did a 14-day quarantine in our hotel with our kids. That was very nerve-wracking and a lot of that kind of stuff. So we felt very called by the Lord to go there. We went there. We feel very much that we did what God called us to do in a very tough ministry environment that had a city with almost no churches. It was a very large city by Cambodian standards. By Asian standards, it's not actually all that big, Sahanoukville. Most of Cambodian cities aren't actually all that big by Asia standards due to their very rough history with the Khmer Rouge and all of that kind of stuff. But we were there for a year. We were able to do what we could in the situation, but it was pretty clear that at the end of the year, as surprising as it was to us, we were not called to come back to Cambodia for very good ministry reasons that we were a little bit sad about. And we were kind of like, God, what are we doing here? We did all this. We moved here. We made the effort. We did all this stuff. We came halfway across the world. We were willing to put up with all of this and keep going. Why would you close this ministry door in an environment that really needs it? But at the same time, as we told people that we knew what we were having to do and how that that opportunity was closing to us because of some tough stances on biblical truths that we took, a person was like, hey, guess what? We have a need over here for a teacher in Indonesia. What do you think? And so even though it was not at all what we left America with the ideas of doing, we came over here, and so far only been here a couple months, but we love it. It is in almost every way the exact opposite of the situation where we were. Before, we were almost completely alone. Now we have many people. Before, we were just isolated and trying to do a bunch of stuff, and it was just frustrated every turn. Here, many more smooth landing, and being a part of a team and being a part of a large community and not being just completely isolated is a huge blessing for our family.
That's amazing. That's so good to hear. So in Indonesia, it's a majority Muslim country. Are you teaching at a Bible school, or what are you doing there?
Yeah, so we are teaching at a Christian school. I do have to be careful, but I am a morality and ethics teacher, and so that is what I am teaching, and I love teaching it. I love teaching all the things that you can imagine that can go into that as well. So yeah, it's a big blessing to be here and be teaching it at this school, and I get to do, is a Christian school. We also get to be involved in chapels and all kinds of stuff like that, and getting to help mostly other missionary students, but also people from the community as well, just discussing these kind of things.
That's great. Has there been anything, one of the reasons I love traveling, and I enjoyed doing missions work and experiencing new cultures, was the cuisine. I would find random flavored chips. Lay's has all these brands overseas that you're like, why is it shellfish flavored? But has there been anything in Indonesia that's either been surprising or that you found really good since you've been on the ground there?
Yeah, so we've lived in China before this, Cambodia before this, and now we've lived here in Indonesia. And one thing I really like about Indonesia is they're very, it's kind of like Southern America. They like to fry everything. Every meal comes like it's already been fried a couple times over, and I really like that. I'm a big fan. I enjoy good fried chicken or fried beef or fried whatever they have. So we've been getting along really well in that way, and I definitely enjoy that more than boiled meat. So I think it's a big advantage.
That's great, man. All right, well, let's talk about the podcast. So you went to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. You moved your family halfway across the world, but you've got this cool podcast going where you are doing several things, several different podcasts. One, though, is kind of getting people to read sermons from, basically old dead Christians, right? Old pastors, theologians of yesteryear. What kind of inspired you to start doing that?
Yeah, so we really do. It's not even just basically old dead. They have to be dead, because our theory is if you can hear them live or you can hear the recording, go listen to them. We won't read their sermon, better than we do, right? At one point, we did even have a radio show where we kind of take those old radio sermons and do stuff with that, but we would never read those. Every once in a while, a listener will write and be like, what about Martin Lloyd-Jones' sermons or something? I'm like, well, why would I read his sermons? He's still, you can go listen to him do it.
Yeah.
But the idea was just kind of, we realized that nobody was doing this. There's these famous sermons like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, by Jonathan Edwards and stuff like that. And you might see people reading some of those sermons. You might see people reading Charles Spurgeon sermons. There's a couple guys who do that. But when it comes to the vast majority of sermons that have ever been preached throughout history, they are all in books, and most of us don't know anything about them. And after reading some of those sermons, I realized, oh my goodness, despite the fact that these sermons were preached well beyond our lifetimes, they have amazing truth that lasts way beyond what they're doing. And it's amazing how often, I would say almost every time we get an email from a listener, which they come in all the time, people say, relevant. I am blown away by how this show, talking about a guy who lived 500 years, 600 years, 1,400 years, literally one of our oldest sermons is 1,600 years, 1,700 years old, right?
Wow.
Yet that sermon was relevant to what I was going through today. It's almost like humanity doesn't change, and when you exegete God's word properly, it's going to apply to you at all times. And yet there's also something about hearing somebody else say it, who lived a long time outside of your world, saying it the way they know how to say it, that hits you just different. And to be honest, too, they're good. These guys are, there's a reason Charles Spurgeon, Jonathan Edwards, John Calvin, John Owen, St. Augustine, some of these guys were the best, right? And we can learn a lot from them and a lot from the way they preach and the things that they did. We might not want to mimic everything they do. We do live in a different time, and we want to do it in a way that is good for us today, but also realizing that sometimes we get kind of caught in a bubble of listening to only the guys that are alive today and hearing how they do it. And we kind of all go to the same conferences and read the same books, and then we start to sound the same. And when you get this infusion of history from someone who's completely outside our world, Robert Murray McShane or Andrew Bonar, or one of these guys coming just from a completely different place, it helps kind of remind you of how to get outside your bubble a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. When I listen to a modern day preacher, it can be really easy as a preacher myself to start to pick up on their intonations and their kind of inflections. And, if I listen to a Matt Chandler sermon, then I'm going to pick up some mannerisms there.
Soon you're going to be camping out in this text over here for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of hand motions. But I think with listening to older sermons, it reminds you of, I'll put it this way. The pulpit today is much more entertainment oriented, whether preachers mean to or not. It's just especially in the American context, it's much more about entertainment and joking. And when you look back on those older sermons, you realized how much decorum there was, how much respect, and how they approached the office with a bit more reverence. And so, I think it's fun to listen to those because it encourages me. If it's inevitable that when you listen to somebody else, you're going to pick up on their mannerisms. It's just how people connect. It's how God designed us to relate to one another. But if you do that, if let's say that's true, and then you go listen to an old dead guy preach, and then you do pick up some of those kind of inflection points or emphases in the text, you're probably going to be more inclined to approach the pulpit and preaching with a bit more reverence than if you go listen to the latest podcast from the next great speaker in America. And so that's why I like listening to these older guys. You mentioned the oldest podcast. I mean, the oldest episode that had been read was a sermon from like 1400 years ago. What sermon was that?
I mean, we've done sermons by Basil, Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa. I mentioned Augustine. We even did a sermon by Origen, although I do know that he's quite a controversial figure. And I mean, so people like that, but we're giving you their sermons, and that's kind of an opinion of our show too. We have our own theological takes. We definitely have our own theology. We're not putting Mormons or anything like that on, but at the same time, we do try to bring people from different camps on and say, hey, you make the decision. And sometimes I find that when people listen to the sermons by episodes, even from people they don't agree with, we have George Whitefield, but we also have John Wesley as well. And I find an interesting thing occurs where people kind of go, oh, okay, actually now that I get it, why that guy was so popular, and maybe his movement's not quite as bad and heretical as I thought he was, and maybe that's how George Whitefield and John Wesley were able to bury the hatchet, because when they got in the pulpit, they were both preaching Christ, crucified. And so some of those sermons, though, but we go back for the very old sermons. We always give the backstory of these preachers, too. And so we tell you, hey, here's who this guy is. Here's some of those controversies. Here's some of the good things they did. Make your own decision, audience. I don't want to make the decision for you. And so sometimes I'll have people on that I'm like, man, I don't know, I love this guy or not, but we're going to let the audience decide on that. And people sometimes will go, man, I heard people I would have never heard of before. And sometimes they're like, what were you doing with that one? It's up to you. It's up to you. But then sometimes people write us back on regular people, too. Like, I had a guy write us one time on Charles Spurgeon and said, hey, a bunch of people aren't going to get saved because he wasn't pro-infant baptism, and now you're putting a heretic on your show. And I'm like, all right, so some people you're not going to make happy no matter what, so.
That's amazing. And it looks like, you've got a pretty good reach on the podcast. Do you have a lot of people kind of tuning in to listen to all these historically famous, significant sermons?
Yeah, so it was really surprising because I remember when we first started telling people about the show, no one understood what we were saying. And it took us a while to get the first 9 or 10 episodes recorded because we're like, hey, can you read this sermon for us from the past? We're going to record it. I'm editing it so it sounds modern again. Can you read that? And the people just were kind of like, I don't really fully get what you're trying to do. And when we did send it to one guy, he's like, this is going to be great. There's going to be a lot of academics, professors at seminaries. They're going to love this show. It's going to be very popular among that tiny niche of people. And I was like, you might be right, but I kind of hope you're wrong. I hope other people love it. I actually find that in general, they are not our number one audiences at all. We do have pastors and we do have professors that listen and will speak sermons. But by and large, it's a lot of moms. It's a lot of regular college students. It's a lot of just what your regular people who aren't seminary professors who go, hey, I don't know a lot of church history. Hey, I don't know any other way to get access to John Owen. I don't have time to sit here and read, a book, but I can listen to a sermon, and that would be a great way for me to intro these guys. And we also have a lot of English as second language learners who are kind of scared to read Puritan writings and stuff because it's in Old English.
Sure.
But my sermons, because we edit it for them before we send it out, it's really accessible for them. So we have a lot of listeners in the Philippines, and we have a lot of people who aren't your seminary highest theologically educated people who are getting access to this material, and it's really been a huge blessing because that was kind of who we were hoping it would be. And we also do have the really high-minded people who are, very sophisticated, who will send me an email when I get a detail wrong and tell me all the different things too.
Totally, dude. That's funny. So you've also got a couple other. Well, I guess before I ask about the other episodes, do you host these shows with a friend or what's going on there?
As my co-host is Joel. We've known each other since our early days at Bible college over a decade ago, and he works as a missions videographer for BMW. So he kind of does all the editing, tech stuff. I do more of the research, get the episodes, edit the sermons, that kind of stuff, and together. We do that, and then we kind of run a podcast studio. We call it Revived Studios because originally it was one podcast, but then our next podcast, Revived Devos, came out, and then there was Revived Radio, and then once you just keep putting Revived on everything, you got to keep it, so we went with Revived Studios. And then my wife broke that whole thing with Martyrs and Missionaries, which ended up being, per episode, the most popular of our shows. And she really has a great reach because she does stories about martyrs and missionaries. And people love stories like that, especially she does a really good job of doing the research and just getting a broad swath of history, where she'll jump from, Lilias Trotter was her last episode. Then she jumped over to the history of the Huguenots that just happened to come out very coincidentally the day of the Bartholomew Massacre, which was yesterday, remembrance, which I would love to say was marketing wizardry, but it was actually just a pure coincidence that she put that out on that day.
That's amazing. I love when that happens. So with Revived Devos, so you've got Revived the sermons, and then with the Devos, what are these? What are y'all presenting on that platform?
So yeah, that show it's really pretty simple. It's just devotionals, and it was really just, I noticed that there aren't like a lot of really good Christian devotionals out there, especially podcast ones to listen to. I'm not dissing on anybody who's doing it, but I'm like, when you look at a devotional, they're kind of asking you, hey, trust me. You don't know me at all, but you listen to this devotional for a couple minutes. And I was like, I don't really love that. So we started Revived Devos, which is just a little bits of history from different men like Martin Luther, St. Augustine. We had Jonathan Edwards, Lemuel Haynes. We've had a kind of rotating cast of people, Andrew Murray, Richard Baxter, that we put on there. We just take some tidbits from their stuff that we think works as a good kind of thoughtful devotional. And then you can listen to 2 or 3 minutes of that. And the next day you get a different guy. It kind of rotates every 7 days through. And it's a nice little show. It's a great show for a morning cup of coffee, after you read your Bible or something like that. If you don't have a lot of time, just a little Devo to kind of jump you in. And we have listeners of that. And I think it's a good show for people where there was kind of a lack. We tried to fill that need.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've always been recommending the Dwell app for people that want to, get some Bible in their car on their commute. It makes it easy, but it sounds like this is a great opportunity to also get some historical content in people's hands that's solid and can help people grow in godliness. One of the questions, kind of going back to your story, your context, I'm curious to know this. If you're the ethics teacher, what are some big issues? Because it's easy in an American context as an American pastor to look at, I'm dealing with my own stuff we've got going on in our context. What are the issues that your students are bringing up, or that they seem to be most kind of curious to know answers to over in Indonesia?
So it was kind of depressing to me, as I have been, last year I was in Cambodia, and this year I've been in Indonesia, and yet it's a lot of the same things. The same kind of LGBTQ progressive issues of gender, really? And it's here, it's there, it's in Cambodia, it's pretty common, and it's because they're all getting it from the same place, which is TikTok and YouTube. And so the bad ideas that are in America have like a hurricane swept out into the world, that I have a lot of high school students who are asking those same questions and challenging their ethics teachers on the same issues. Is still a problem even out here today, but in also a very different way, because we're working with students who are very much growing up in a setting. Not all of them, but many of them are growing up not where their home country is. They really struggle with, who am I? Am I just the product of my parents who have this faith? Is this actually my faith? What do I do with the fact that I'm being raised by this kind of faith that's not at all the same as the country that I feel more closely identified with, because I was raised pretty much in this country, yet it's not the faith of the country. It's not even really connected. And so there's just kind of all those identity, who am I questions. What I appreciate is that a lot of the students here are really wrestling and asking those questions and figuring out, and they'll tell you, like, I don't know if the faith of my parents is my faith. Whereas I do think sometimes in America, a lot of the kids are like, when I go to church on Sunday, it's fine, whatever, that's, good enough, right? And the kids here will recognize, like, that's not enough. To be a Christian is more than that. But then they'll look at you and also go, but I don't know that I'm ready for more than that. I don't know that I'm in for more than that. And so in some ways, it's a more honest dialogue, and other ways, it's a more difficult dialogue.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, it sounds like some of them could really benefit from listening to your podcast on the sermons from the past. Because when I listen to the sermons from yesteryear, from Spurgeon, or I'm researching the Puritans, and I listen to these sermons, there's not a lot of ambiguity about the call. Kind of the Billy Graham kind of like attitude of, we've got to have an invitation at the end. That may or may not have a place or whatever, but my point is that these Puritan sermons were very, I think most of, like, if I preached like a Puritan today, most people would view it as heavy-handed and legalistic.
Amen.
And it's like, no, they're trying to push the law of God so that it convicts sinners and they see their need for a Savior. And then they preach the grace of Christ. And I think for a lot of young Christians, they just don't get that message very often. And then when they do, you know, they really don't want to hear it. And so it makes it really challenging as a preacher. Well, that's really interesting that it's kind of got over there with TikTok and YouTube. Do you recommend to your students, like, hey, don't be on TikTok, or like how do you help them navigate that stuff?
So in general, I just say don't bother TikTok. I mean, it was created by China. It's not supposed to be an app that's supposed to help anybody. And China created it and then banned all their own people from using it. So that should tell you something, right? Like when they create a product and don't let their people use it, it means they don't trust what it's going to do to you. But I know there are some people who like it. What I do tell my students is I'm like, hey, you don't trust everything you hear somebody. You hear me right now. I'm talking about revived thoughts in church history, but don't. If I say something about history, go check it yourself. Make sure I'm right. I can be wrong. I could have either had my sources wrong, and there are genuinely misleading people out there. They could be trying to trick you. So go and double check. If I said something that you don't like, go double check me. That's fine. Like I said, I get emails that correct me sometimes. I don't mind that because I would rather people be doing their homework and doing their investigations and researching what they're doing than just blindly trust me. We need to be, as Christians, we need to be past the blindly trust our Christian leader stage at this point, because that has not served us very well. On the other side of it, though, I also say there's another way to go, too. If you're going to be online, as most of them are, fill your time with positive content. There are Christian memers that are pretty funny. There are great Christian podcasts. There are great, you can do more than just listen to Hillsong on YouTube and have that playing in the background when you're online. You can actually spend that time filling your life with, thoughtful discussions. If you're going to be on a social media, go find that Christian group and just try to be subscribed to all those Christian groups. When I started Revived Thoughts, I started subscribing to all these groups because I was going to tell them about my podcast. And then I realized I just enjoy my social media a lot more now. I don't really spend a lot of time with my old high school friends and those people anymore because I'm too busy interacting with all these different interesting Christian people who are having these interesting conversations. Yes, to a degree, that's me living in a bubble, but I'm also just curating the experience to be one that's actually enjoyable and edifying for me, right? Am I living in a bubble if I go to a restaurant and I order good food and I don't just order everything on the menu? No, of course not. I'm making it better place. And I found that now my social media is a pretty positive, pretty edifying place. Yes, sure, we're on Twitter having the same 8 fights every day, but sometimes those are even fun, I don't mind them all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point because I think there's a lot of criticism about, it inevitably creates an echo chamber. And I'm like, well, that is just part of human finitude and limitations is you will, by going to a church, let's just use that in real life. If you commit to going to church every Sunday, some could call that you're living in an echo chamber. You're not open to new ideas. And it's like, no, I'm choosing who I am going to be formed by. And God has placed these certain people. And that it just so happens with social media that I can choose certain people that I want to hear from and certain people I don't. And that's what I always tell people. If you don't like what I have to say, go, you can unfollow. It's totally fine. No sweat. Because I really do believe it's actually healthy for you. The attitude of this kind of ideal pluralism where we've got to you've got to make sure you have all these different viewpoints represented on your timeline. I think that's insane. I think that makes you crazy because it makes you really anxious. There's all this, fighting and disagreement. And there's like you've said, there's a good, healthy disagreement that can happen online. But oftentimes there's so much this weird value of pluralism gets into kind of how you've got to read all these variety of sources. And it's you don't have to. God didn't make it some kind of standard in the Bible where, well, make sure you check out all the viewpoints. I'm I don't need to do that. I can look at church history, I can look at God's word, and I can go to trusted sources. Mm-hmm. With Indonesia, specifically on these matters, it being a Muslim country, are there pride parades like you're seeing here in America, or what's going on there on the ground?
No, not in Indonesia. In Cambodia, which also technically has homosexuality banned as well. They did have during Pride Month, there were all these pride stuff was out and about, which I thought was very surprising, for
that
Cambodia. But it wasn't like everywhere, but there were definitely signs. There was a pharmacy specifically that was like discounts for the Pride Month. Basically, I'm like, I'm not even sure this pharmacy knows what they're fully advertising, but they got the rainbow flag, they got the Pride Month. You know, nothing else on the sign is English, but they're doing that one thing. And so I thought that was really interesting to see in the middle of Phnom Penh. In a part of the world that's not really as much about that stuff, yet those Western things have dribbled out. It's one of the reasons, too, that I get really upset with Christians in the West sometimes, where we'll be like, oh, you know, I want to force my beliefs on people. And I'm like, man, the other side is so much better at forcing their beliefs on people. They're getting their message out. We've got to at least match their ferocity, right? Because the Pride people are doing so much better at getting the world to hear their message, and I don't think that's good. Indonesia, they're a little bit more, you know, I don't know, I haven't been here that long, but I'm not seeing pride parades. I'm not seeing that stuff. But, and I don't know how much, I mean, it's certainly not legal on the books as far as I'm pretty sure concerned. At the same time, they've been really warning us about monkeypox, which I find interesting considering how that occurs.
That is fascinating.
I mean, it's probably here, but it's probably a little bit more undercover, and I think it probably depends where you live. If you live in Jakarta, it's more metropolitan. It's a big city. People all over the world. From my little short time there interacting with people, I get the impression it's present. Where I'm at is a little bit more, you know, kind of out in the, you know, not the boon. It's not in the boonlands at all, but like certainly there you could be rural. We're not the rural, but we're not the big metropolitan city either. And so I think we're a little more. We're going to see less of that outwardly, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening inwardly, if that makes sense. So
for sure.
And I think just in the context, I'm still new. So if somebody's hearing this, and I'm like, I've been living in Indonesia for 15 years, getting all this stuff wrong. I'm pretty brand new here, so give me a break. But I will say, it seems to me that when you live in a Muslim country, there's a lot more of kind of like that. I'm outwardly doing one thing, even if, you know, inwardly it's not truly what I align myself with, but I got to kind of put on that air of looking like that. And in some ways, I feel like I see like there feels like a parallel to Catholicism and Mormonism, and that kind of just, if you perform the work, what you do outside your time is kind of your time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is with the freedom of religion over there in Indonesia, do they allow Christians to gather for church? Or is it, you know, when I was overseas in a Muslim context, like if we wanted to meet for church, it had to be, you know, not, you know, publicized at all. We couldn't talk about it or anything like that. What does it look like there in Indonesia?
Different. It depends on where you're at. So where we're at, you know, in Indonesia, you have to like sign up, especially on the main island, which is where we are. You have to sign up like what your religion is. Really, I think it's like 16 or 18. And so you punch a card, you're like, I am this. And if you're a Buddhist, you can go do Buddhist stuff on the island. That's fine. You can't proselytize, so you can't make more Buddhists. But if you don't proselytize and bother anybody, you can go be Buddhist. That's kind of fine. Except for it also just depends on where you're at. So if you're on islands or towns or cities where they're very Muslim, they might not want you to be Buddhist there. They might not want you to be a Christian there. They might say you're not really welcome. We're going to make you not feel comfortable. And there are places where it's like that. But some of the islands, they have not officially declared a religion. And so you are allowed to go send people over there. But the Muslims are also there working to finish those islands too. It's a lot of like stuff. And to be honest, to some degree, I get told, you know, don't talk too much about this. There are some things I can't explain, so I'm not supposed to. And there are some things where I don't fully understand enough to explain. But kind of a little bit of, you know, are there churches? Are people gathering? In some, where I'm at, they're fine. And other areas, they would not be. And so it really kind of depends on what part of Indonesia you're in. Indonesia is quite a large country, even though it's just a bunch of islands. So one island might be like, yeah, we're kind of fine with that. It's not a big deal. And another island might be like, nah, you're not bringing that here. And if we find it, we're going to make life very difficult for you.
Okay, so when you think about as a Christian and an ethics teacher, you know, part of the Great Commission is to make disciples. And so in America, we have some people that, you know, they put a pretty strong wall up. Like I was at a meeting yesterday for chaplains in my area in Boulder County, and a lot of civic leaders, they really don't like that we even have chaplains for the police department or the fire department. And so I've experienced that overseas. I've experienced that here. When you think about words like evangelism or make disciples or proselytize, how is it that you kind of parse that out in ethics for students?
Okay, that's a great question. So actually, that's where church history jumps in. Let me take you back to a little story. So you're probably familiar with the gentleman named William Carey, one of the biggest, most world-famous missionaries there is, right? Most people don't realize, though, when he landed in India, it was not smooth sailing at all. It was actually very, very difficult. And part of his work in that country led to people getting upset. They were so mad that Christians were there and that Christians were getting converted that a riot occurred. And then back home, the people who were working, were kind of in the area were saying, see, this is why we shouldn't bother the people. We caused riots. People lost their lives. You Christians did this. This is why we don't bring them the faith. This isn't how we do it. And you've caused all these problems. And those people, those kind of quote unquote Christians saying you're causing all these problems, ended up causing William Carey's, very young, early days of mission work, his little early days of evangelism there, more problems than anybody else, right? This is not a new phenomena. This has been going on for a long time. Look at Hudson Taylor. When he arrived in China, almost the exact same story took place in his time too, where they started doing things, riots would break out, and people would blame the Christian Inland Missions. They would blame Hudson Taylor and these people. They were getting inroads into places no one had ever been before, and yet they were getting blamed for any problems that wouldn't even be caused by them. It could be caused by other Europeans that landed there. Hey, look, there's a new city. Let's go see what China Inland Mission found. They get drunk, they do whatever, but China Inland Mission gets the blame. And then back home, people go, and that's why we can't do that. This has been going on and will always happen when ministry is occurring. So when people go, oh, I don't know, can I send chaplains? They're not very friendly. Do we want to? Yes, go ahead. Do it anyway. They're going to resist you no matter what you do. You might as well go all in, because you never know. You never know who's listening whenever you share the gospel. You never know who's listening whenever you get the chance to share with people. You might be the person that gets one civic leader to actually reconsider things, and who knows what kind of play that might have on history. But also, it's what we're called to do. Anytime we do it, it always happens. We just need to get out there and do it anyway. Retreating and running away is the worst thing we can do. During the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and them are out there preaching, and there were some guys who were going too far. They were doing this very emotional, weird stuff. And there was a critic who was hammering them, and he was using all the excesses of the Great Awakening, and he was saying, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the problem, this is the Great Awakening. And people were having to kind of write back and be like, this is not all the Great Awakening. There's a lot of what's going on is good. You're taking the worst parts of it and saying that's all of it. And they had this fight with this guy his whole life, and he was like, this is just not what we need. When that guy died, they go into his house and they find out he was not a Christian. He had written his own book on how he's a universalist and how he had no interest in God. He just had been too scared to publish it, and so it sat there unfinished. The guy was never a Christian, yet they spent so much time battling with this guy, thinking he was just a Christian worried about our testimony. That was never what he was really about. And sometimes I think we Christians need to be a little bit wiser and realize sometimes we're having these battles about people who are worried how we quote-unquote come off to everybody, and then we're going to find out when they die that we're going to find that unpublished universalist tome and realize these guys were not with us, yet they had no problem pretending to be to critique us. And that's something we need to recognize happens.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for highlighting those two examples. It's really helpful. Well, I want to make sure I get people to your content because I think it's really helpful. What's the kind of a place they can go and subscribe to the podcast that we've talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to, we're on everywhere. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, go to Revived Thoughts. If you want to find our website, revivedthoughts.com, where we have all of our shows, Revived Thoughts, Martyrs Missionaries, and Revived Devos. And we have other shows as well. Go check all of those out and hopefully subscribe. Find something that you enjoy and that will teach you more about church history. You mentioned quite a while back when we were talking about sermons, that one thing that's missing today. And I tell you what, when you listen to sermons of the past, you really do realize how much is missing, and what survives, what's going to be remembered from this era is the people who preach Christ, people who preached heaven, people who preached hell, and people who preach that there is going to be a death. Those are the things that really are going to last, and you really see it when you study history, I think.
Yeah, that's great, man. Well, thanks so much for spending time with me. And if you're a listener, I just want to remind you again, we've got the Patreon link in the bio. You can go check that out, sign up for any dollar amount. Any dollar amount helps. I've also got a special partnership for this episode. It's sponsored by Gold River Trading Co., goldrivertradingco.com. You can head over there, use promo code Theology for 15% off your order. You can get some great product, get some tea, get some pumpkin spice tea. It's that season of the year. And if you want your wife to stop spending so much money at Starbucks, go get her this tea and make some for her at home. But until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for joining me today.